Good morning. Welcome to Gary's first webinar of the year. We are focusing on the role of blended finance for adaptation and resilience. Those of you who have been to Gary events, meetings, webinars before probably have some familiarity with how we do this. Gary is the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group. We are a US-based nonprofit, and we are really here to figure out what are the barriers in getting private sector investors to invest in adaptation and resilience. Where are there investment opportunities that investors are either not taking advantage of, don't know about, or don't know how to take advantage of? And that's really what brings us to the webinar today. In putting together programming for the year, especially focused on emerging markets, blended finance came up as one of the most important tools to getting private sector investment into adaptation and resilience, especially in key sectors that are experiencing the most impacts from climate change or can be the most responsive to needs of climate change in certain regions and states. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. This is part of our CALE program, the Climate Adaptation, Innovation, and Learning Program. It is funded by the Global Environmental Facility and implemented with UNIDO. If you have any questions about the program, what that means, feel free to send me a direct message. And I think we won't really pause much longer. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to the folks at Convergence for a very brief interview or a brief intro. And they're going to give us a high level, what is blended finance? How does it apply to this sector? What are we even talking about? And then really get more into the detail of what's actually happening with blended finance and adaptation and resilience. And then a little bit later this morning, we'll hear from One Acre Fund, who's worked with Convergence. How have they actually implemented a blended finance structure successfully? We'll have a couple of opportunities for Q&A. So if you have questions for the speakers, please drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring those. And again, we're going to pause for Q&A twice. Once after Convergence sort of gives their presentation, and again at the end to One Acre Fund, but everybody will be there to take questions at that time. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I've got the deck from Convergence, but would one of you is one of you planning on sharing it? Great. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Why don't I introduce myself and then Robin, and then I can take it back and we can head right into the presentation. So hello, everybody. Nice to meet you all. My name is Sneha Thile. I'm a senior associate on the training and engagement team here at Convergence, and I also spend part of my time working in Latin America in our regional team. My own background is in monitoring and evaluation with humanitarian and development projects in East Africa. So I've come full circle from working, seeing some of these catalytic capital being deployed in these types of situations to now seeing how models can be tweaked and how things can be improved with a more efficient use of this capital through blended finance. So over to you, Robin, for your intro.
Thanks, Sneha. Hi, everybody. I'm Robin Ivory, and I'm a senior associate on our content team at Convergence. So the content team is responsible for a lot of the output done by Convergence. Some of you might have seen the State of Blended Finance. Our case studies or data briefs all come from our team. So I'll be walking you through some of the trends that we see within our database and providing a little bit more tangible actions on adaptation financing. So I'll let Sneha take it away first with some introduction and overview of blended finance and Convergence.
Thanks, Robin. So for the next bit of time, we're going to go over these three specific topics. So a little bit of contextualization for blended finance to understand what it is and where it sits, as well as a dive into the definitions and concepts that we see frequently. And then I'll hand over to Robin to get into really the meat of the matter, which is what we have on blended finance for adaptation. So some context for those of you in the room. I understand there is quite some familiarity with blended finance, but maybe a quick refresher from the top. Blended finance really seeks to bridge the SDG funding gap that we're all have been working on for all of these years. So I understand that after the pandemic, these numbers were revised. We still need about over $4 trillion annually to bridge this funding gap, whereas official development assistance, increasingly diminishing actually in today's tumultuous times, only flows around a little over $200 billion anyway prior to this. So, SDG funding by ODA is simply a small drop in the bucket of the need that is needed. So how do you bridge this funding gap? So that is where at the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015, blended finance emerged as really one of the methods to bridge this funding gap by using this catalytic capital to attract private capital to finance these projects in this move from billions to trillions. Worldwide private net worth, for example, in wealth stands at over 400 trillion. So that is a lot of untapped potential that we could bring in to developing countries, to emerging markets, to SDG positive transactions to fill this funding gap. So how does this mobilization work? Through the power of leverage. So by using this very scarce catalytic or concessional capital that's already dedicated towards these goals, to mobilize additional capital from the private sector, not necessarily at concessional terms, perhaps at commercial terms, at leverage ratios ranging oftentimes between 2 to 8. So that is, for every concessional dollar in a deal, we're mobilizing an additional 2 commercial dollars or up to 8 commercial dollars. So obviously the higher the better. So using this type of leverage function, we're able to attract much more investment to these developing countries, emerging markets, SDG positive transactions, and that's what we would like to see. Just so you know, right now, according to our database, leverage ratios in blended finance roughly stand at about $1 to $4, a little over $4 for concessional to commercial. So we're seeing some progress, but we'd love to see that leverage ratio improve. So why is Convergence looking at all this? So in 2015, we were stood up when Global Affairs Canada raised its hand at the time to take front in establishing a central hub and repository for all things blended finance. So we are the global network for blended finance. This year is actually our 10-year anniversary. And we're dedicated to guiding, educating, connecting, and mobilizing the blended finance landscape. So we have the largest database of blended finance transactions, and a lot of our education and thought leadership and guidance comes from managing and analyzing this database. We have a membership network where we seek to connect and mobilize the space, and we have a grant portfolio where we seek to launch new transactions in the market as well. So this is overall what we do and who we are. So what is blended finance? Some of you may be familiar with some different definitions in this space, especially those of you who maybe are more tied to donor spaces or DFI spaces. But for Convergence, our definition fundamentally lies in the involvement of the private sector. So for Convergence, blended finance is the use of catalytic capital from either public or philanthropic sources to increase private sector investment in developing countries. So our mandate is exclusively developing countries, which is the ODA eligible World Bank list. And we're only interested in transactions that are mobilizing private sector capital. I know donor agencies, certain DFIs have broader definitions that allow any additional capital mobilized to be considered blended. But for Convergence, combinations of DFI capital with another DFI or with IFC or these types of configurations of familiar faces working together are not getting at the heart of what we want to see, which is new capital unlocked and brought into this market. So our emphasis is on attracting the private sector. Blended finance is a structuring approach, which is why it's different from some of what you'll see with the appendage of finance tied to it. So, impact investing, project finance, public-private partnerships. These are all very different things. Blended finance itself is solely the structuring approach where different types of capital can sit together regardless of motivation, mission, or intent. So achieving their own objectives while the overall transaction is SDG impact positive. Blended finance, through this structuring approach, allows the involvement of a wide variety of stakeholders. So you can see on the slide in front of you, here are the 3 typical buckets of categories that we see capital emerging from. So on the leftmost column, we see the most impactful capital providers, which are typically from philanthropy or aid. These are aid agencies, donors, NGOs, high net worth individuals. They're often seeking only social returns, not necessarily interested in financial returns or sometimes even able to receive financial returns. So they're extremely risk seeking, have no need to make their money back, but are extremely interested in the actual impacts of their participation. In the middle bucket, we have the most flexible capital bucket oftentimes, which is the impact and social investors. These are often family offices, impact investment firms. They have both interests, so they are often looking to perhaps preserve their original capital investment, but are also seeking social and financial returns. And they often have much more agility in terms of the type of instruments they're able to deploy. So much rather than only grants, they are able to also, deploy debt, equity, participate in more flexible tranches or with more flexible tenor, and they have neutral to averse risk tolerance, so a little bit of a more restricted range, but that's because they do need some sort of capital preservation on their investment. And then the third category is where we see commercial investors sit. So this is often, where we see the institutional investors, banks, pension funds, those who may have fiduciary responsibilities, who have the least risk tolerance or mandate at all. Some may not even be able to invest in developing countries at all. Some may have particular seeds that they've pulled out or allocated towards these types of investments. They have a real need to make returns on their investment, may not necessarily have a mandate for the social or environmental impacts at all, and tend to be risk averse, either due to their mandate or some other portfolio mission basis. However, all of these types of investors through blended finance are able to participate in a single transaction in one structure. So the transaction itself can be, any type of vehicle. It can be a fund, which is what we see most often in our database, but it can be a facility, a project, a bond, an investment in a single company often. So the vehicle itself, the underlying investment can be structured quite differently, but it is a single structure where all of this money is pooling and aggregating. And each actor takes on their own risk return profile while the overall vehicle is achieving the SDG or impact mandate that we need in blended finance. So that's why this structure works. So the overall vehicle, the logic for why this vehicle becomes investable for all of these different types of investors is on this illustrative graph that we've come up with. So projects without blending, so transactions without blending, whether that be a fund, project, bond, facility, live in the realm of A, where you can see on the graph in front of you. So the blue line, the blue diagonal line, is the market line, the risk return profile for private investors. So transactions can exist anywhere on that blue line, and that blue line is where the expected return on the y-axis and the expected risk on the x-axis are in equilibrium. So if you're investing along the blue line, that means there's an opportunity for you to invest where either, further down on the blue line, the expected risk is very low, but the expected return is very low. And as you escalate up the blue line, as your risk increases, your return increases. This is what we see as the fundamentals of investing. However, a deal before blending, so let's say in an emerging market or in an unfounded or untested sector, oftentimes like adaptation, exists in the realm of A, so below the blue line. That means the risk at point A is unacceptably higher than the expected return of point A. So how blended finance works is it seeks to move a transaction from point A, or the realm of point A below the line, onto the market line. So where you can once again make the overall transaction into an acceptable risk return profile for investors to consider. So you can do that through a combination of two methods. One is measures that move the transaction from A to B, which is by de-risking. So you're reducing the expected risk of a transaction so you can move it sideways laterally from A to B, so that the return stays the same, but your expected risk is lower. Then the next, the alternate that you can do is move the project from A to C. So rather than changing anything about the risk, you can enhance the returns that this transaction is expected to make, and move it from A to C. And any combination of that will move it anywhere across the market line. So this is the overall logic of blended finance. You can either de-risk or you can enhance returns of a transaction so that it becomes an investable opportunity for investors, especially private investors. Maybe I can just throw a small question out there. Can y'all guess in the room which one we see much more of in blended finance? De-risking or return enhancement? Just take a wild guess. Yes, so you would think that, and maybe I phrase this in a leading way, you would think that you would see much more return enhancement, but actually what we see primarily in blended finance is de-risking. Because think about the beginning of a blended finance deal. The donors who are mobilizing the private sector, so the catalytic capital providers, the donors, the philanthropies, they are very hesitant to provide a return enhancement to a transaction compared to de-risking a transaction. There's all sorts of reputational risks involved with seeming to, subsidize or pump up the private sector. So they're often very hesitant to do anything in terms of return enhancement. I would much rather de-risk a transaction to make it, which is more palatable for them and their own, stakeholders or board when they're just deciding how they allocate their funding compared to just pumping up returns on the other end. So yeah. It's actually the other way. Lastly, here are three the key characteristics of a blended finance transaction for convergence. Number one is leverage. The private sector investment needs to have been additional to the project. Otherwise, it would not have been mobilized. This is to avoid that sort of pumping up or overly subsidizing or mobilizing the private sector. You don't need to be where the market already is doing these activities. If the market is already ready to invest in renewable energy in Kenya, you don't need too much blended finance or concessional capital in there. The market there's already a track record. The market's doing well. People are already able to find the capital that they need. The second characteristic is impact. So this is just a mandate for convergence. The overall activity has to contribute to an SDG in a developing country. Not all parties need to have that intent, but the transaction itself does. And then lastly, return. So blended finance is not a silver bullet. It's not intended to be used to completely replace all charitable giving or all public budgets or the total use of concessional or grant capital. It's really meant for sectors where there is money to be made. So an investment needs to be making some sort of positive financial return. Otherwise, why blend? Why would a private investor invest at all? So blended finance works well for sectors that have established business models, have track records, have the ability to make returns from either concessional to market rate. So that's where it works best, and a bit less so. That's why we see less transactions in blended finance, for example, for primary education or community-based healthcare or sectors where there's a little bit less maybe bankability or investability. So those are some of the quick concepts and definitions of blended finance. And now Robin and I are going to go over some of the key archetypes and instruments that we see in blended finance. So convergence, through our database, we've analyzed the structure of over 1,200 blended finance transactions worldwide. And these fall, as we've seen, in four typical, most common archetypes or structures. So the most common one that we see is the first one, which is the use of concessional debt or equity within the capital structure. So on the screen, you can see in blue is where the commercial capital sits, and gray is where you see the use of this concessional capital. So in concessional debt or equity, the public or philanthropic investors are concessional within the same capital structure. So they're providing either debt or equity on better terms or terms that cannot be found in the market, either a longer tenor at a better interest rate, or with some sort of grace periods, or there's features of the debt the loan that they're giving or the equity investment that they're making that cannot be found in that market for this transaction, and that's what makes it concessional. We do have one example of this to bring it to life. Robin, do you want to cover this one?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sneha. So we're going to give you a couple of case studies that revolve around these archetypes. And the idea of this is to give you a practical approach of how different elements of blended finance can be used within adaptation transactions. I get asked all the time in adaptation financing, how do you create a viable revenue stream from adaptation focused initiatives, and especially in risky markets? So each of these examples that you're going to see, they share not only examples of how elements of blended finance can work together within the financial structure that Sneha just walked us through, but they also focus on different aspects of adaptation and creating revenue generating opportunities within that. So hopefully that'll shed some light on how adaptation financing is actually used in practice. And I won't go too much into the case studies. I'll leave that for One Acre Fund at the end of the presentation to discuss what they've done in more detail. But let's look first at the Insure Resilience Fund. So this was a fund that was launched in 2020 with a $230 million start, and it provides debt and equity financing to MSMEs, as well as low-income households in developing countries. And its aim is to improve access to insurance and reduce their vulnerability to extreme weather events. So protection from extreme weather events allows beneficiaries to invest and increase their savings, and simultaneously it improves the overall development of the economy. And improved access to appropriate insurance products also enhances resilience of local businesses and increases their bankability. So we see a really heavy adaptation focus within this fund. So the fund itself is structured as an umbrella fund and includes a debt fund and a private equity fund. The debt sub-fund lends to financial institutions in the climate and agri sectors, and the private equity sub-fund invests in insurers and service providers. So quickly, let's go a little deeper into the elements of the fund itself. Both sub-funds were seeded with endowments from BMZ Germany, which was invested through KfW. And these investments capitalized the sub-fund's junior tranches, and they acted as first loss risk cushions for the more senior tiers intended for private capital. So this is really looking from moving A to B, de-risking this transaction. And the balance of the debt fund's debt sub-fund features senior development capital and private sector commitments from family offices and other commercial entities. And meanwhile, there's a senior tranche of the equity sub-fund, and that's divided into 4 separate share classes. One of the top share classes is reserved for development financiers, including the European Investment Bank, and the remaining are offered to private investors at various risk-return opportunities. The first loss components are considered particularly valuable by senior investors within this fund, given the exposure to foreign exchange risk. So I'll also quickly mention that the fund benefits from 2 technical assistance facilities, which Sneha will speak to a little bit more later. One provides pre- and post-investment expertise to investees to improve design and delivery of the insurance solutions. And the second provides support for a facility that will, for a limited time, subsidize premium payments for SMEs and households that have purchased coverage from the fund's providers. So this is a really good example of that concessional debt and equity layer within a fund structure that's de-risking to allow private investors to enter the transaction. And then I'll hand it over to Sneha to walk us through the next archetype.
Thanks, Robin. So over next to guarantees or risk insurance. So although the most common archetype by far we see is the first one, guarantees or insurance can be a powerful tool to mobilize when you're looking to protect from very specific risks like political risk, currency risk, or certain events that you're trying to protect against. The key thing to note here is a guarantee or insurance is not, the presence of a guarantee or insurance does not necessarily mean that a transaction is blended. The blending occurs when the product itself is somehow concessional or is there's some sort of concessionality, either an alternative funder is paying for it, or there's some sort of feature that's not or term that's not offered in the market itself. Otherwise, it's very possible to just go out and get and price yourself some sort of insurance or price some sort of guarantee and just buy it in the market for these products. So the existence of one doesn't make it blended. It's the concessionality feature embedded within it that is what makes a guarantee or risk insurance blended. So the example we have here is for the Sustainable Ocean Fund. Robin, over to you.
Perfect, thanks. So this mini case study is the Athelia Sustainable Ocean Fund, and this one was launched in 2016 at $92 million. So once again, to highlight the adaptation benefits, the fund provides debt or private debt investments in sustainable fisheries, supply chain improvement, and marine conservation. And it invests in sustainable businesses throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa to do things like improve biodiversity, livelihoods, and also the value of the landed catch. And lastly, it invests in sustainable aquaculture, ecotourism, and related environmental markets. And specifically, investees will contribute to improved carbon sequestration practices, marine biodiversity protection, and also showcase innovative methods of marine subsistence activities for more stable livelihoods and food security. So in terms of looking at the blended structure, in terms of its use of guarantees, as we've just been discussing, USAID, via the Development Credit Authority, provided a 50% first loss guarantee, which then acted to crowd in development finance institutions, family offices, and other institutional investors. And the Environmental Defense Fund and Conservation International also provided, again, technical and scientific assistance, and that was earmarked as grants to the fund. The fund does aim for market returns, which will be created through the repayment of project loans and through upside participation via revenue share and equity options. So the guarantees were really important to encouraging this private institutional investors to take part in the transaction, since when the fund was initially fundraising and launching, most ocean-focused investments had come purely through grants and private foundations. So this idea of involving private institutes in it was very nascent at the time of the launch of this fund. And so the guarantee was crucial for giving investors confidence that there would be sovereign guarantee in place. So we see this mobilizing effect very strongly from the guarantee side within this fund. And I'll pass it back to Sneha for technical assistance, design funding. Go ahead.
Thanks, Robin. So the final two archetypes that we see over here, design funding preparation, grant funding or technical assistance funding, both employ the use of grants. So this is where we see a lot of donor activity, especially for those who are not able to deploy alternate instruments. The difference between the two is that design or preparation funding is funding that seeks to support teams that are designing and launching these transactions. A blended finance transaction, for those in the room who have set up maybe more traditional transactions, or I can see JP Givens that you had created the Althelia transaction, you do know the timelines for these, right? These can take time, often up to a year or multiple, or at least multiple years. So the question is, who is paying for this? It takes time to gather all these stakeholders, to do the financial modeling, to do the legal work, to do flights for a roadshow, feasibility studies, proof of concept. All of these take time and take money. And so a big way that blended finance transactions can be helped is if they have grant funding to support that runway, to support the process, often multi-year process of designing and launching these vehicles in the market. So this is something that Convergence ourselves we do. So this is what I referred to in our introduction. Convergence, we do have our own grant portfolio that we've been funding. We administer grant funding from donors or donor consortiums dedicated to designing and launching new solutions in the market. Here's a few of the stats on the solutions that we've supported to date. So what we really like to see is this funding can be very catalytic and very powerful in mobilizing onward raising, because through only awarding about less than 20 million USD, we've been able to mobilize to date almost 2 billion, which is quite a strong leverage ratio. And then the difference between technical assistance is that while grant funding for design and preparation goes to the team to allow the materialization of a transaction, technical assistance goes to the beneficiary, so the investees of a transaction. So once a transaction has come to life or is being brought to life, the investments that they're making, the technical assistance often accompanies those investments to improve the bankability or investability of the investees. So we see this oftentimes in in transactions focused on financial services. They'll have a technical assistance facility accompanying the transaction to, provide, if they're lending to, let's say, women-owned SMEs, then the technical assistance can often accompany the investment to provide training on bookkeeping, on accounting, on all sorts of things to help the final borrowers improve their ability to repay the loan, and therefore the overall transaction is better able to make a return on its investment. So we have an example as well for technical assistance. Robin, over to you for the Agri3 Fund.
Great, thank you so much. So this is our last mini case study that we'll touch on, and it's the Agri3 Fund launched in 2020 with $80 million. And I want to focus primarily again on the role of TA in this, but first I want to start talking about, again, the adaptation focus of the fund. So the purpose of the fund is to influence sustainable land use practices at scale in middle and low income countries. And it does this mainly by providing partial loan guarantees to financial institutions on loans to sustainable agriculture projects that would normally be considered too risky. So it has 3 goals. 1 is forest protection, 2 is sustainable agricultural production, and 3 is improving rural livelihoods. And eligible projects can significantly contribute to attaining climate action goals through things like carbon sequestration and deforestation prevention, and also slowing and reversing biodiversity loss by protecting habitats. So to get a sense of the capital and structure, Agri3 received a $35 million concessional anchor investment from the Netherlands Development Company, or FMO, and this was matched by a commercial investor, Rabobank. It's a 3-tiered structure, and it consists of a first loss equity tranche in mezzanine equity, and then, a first loss equity tranche, a mezzanine equity tranche, and then a senior debt tranche. And the junior tranches will be capitalized by donor and impact-oriented investors to catalyze commercial participation in the more senior levels. So we've seen this a few times now, the use of concessional capital as a means of mobilizing more senior levels of private investment. So now for the role of TA, Agri3 is supplemented by a grant-funded technical assistance facility that is both pre- and post-investment, and its purpose is to accelerate the development of investable opportunities and also to maximize their impact. The facility is managed by IDH, and it will help build the fund's investment pipeline, in addition to improving the ESG standards and monitoring practices of downstream projects. This includes project design support, enhancement of impact monitoring, and knowledge sharing amongst its portfolio. So, for example, the fund has active investments in Brazil, and to support its portfolio within Brazil, through its technical assistance facility, Agri3 has engaged the services of remote sensing and impact advisors to analyze remote sensing data and look for deforestation alerts to help achieve its KPIs. So another example of post-investment TA includes focusing on capacity building for a project in China. So the fund supports this project, and through TA, it supports the project through pasture land renovation and water security it's called the Renova Pasto Loan. Then there's another one that's the Renova Pasto Loan in Colombia that it also supports on capacity building for, and finally on certifications, for example, for soybean seed production in Brazil. So a few different examples there of how post-investment TA has been used to support the pipeline and create feasible transactions. And then on the other hand, we have some pre-investment TA projects, which are mostly benchmarking and needs assessments, but they have also helped in formulating environmental and social action plan requirements to facilitate the Agri3 deals. So that's it on the TA side. Sneha, did you have any final words, or do you want me to go right into the market data?
Sure. So yeah, that's our final example for the four most common archetypes that we see. I do see questions accumulating in the chat, but we're going through the last burst of data that Robin has on blended finance for adaptation specifically, and then we'll hit some of these questions that are coming through. So Robin, over to you for the last section.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to walk us through some high-level data on blended adaptation financing that was collected through Convergence's HDD, which Sneha mentioned before houses over 1,200 transactions, and over 600 of those are climate-focused. So around half our recorded transactions are related to climate initiatives. So we know that interest in climate transactions has grown fairly steadily year over year for the past decade. And in the graphic on the screen, you can see that the number of annual climate deals are shown by the darker blue bars, while the non-climate deals are the lighter blue. And the line graph shows the aggregate financing volume on an annual basis, again for climate and non-climate deals. So you'll notice that while deal count shows steady growth in climate, aggregate financing is a bit more all over the map, and that's in part because annual aggregate financing can be heavily impacted by large deals, which can cause swings in the numbers. And we saw especially this in 2023, which had the highest recorded aggregate financing amounts in the HDD. And that year, we saw a lot of what we call whale transactions, and those are generally $1 billion plus climate deals that are providing scalable solutions. And some of these whale transactions had a strong adaptation focus. So, for example, one of these transactions is a water and sanitation project in Brazil that expands access to drinking water supply, sewage collection, and treatment services across the country. So in the next slide, I want to zoom in on these climate-focused transactions and give a little bit more detail on them by their focus on, again, adaptation, mitigation, or cross-cutting deals, which are those transactions that contain elements of both mitigation and adaptation. I don't think anyone on this call would be super surprised to see that the overwhelming majority of the blended finance supports mitigation transactions, while adaptation-focused deals account for only a very small part of the overall market. Annually, we again see we have a few swings where adaptation has attracted more finance, such as in 2021, where there were a few large adaptation-focused funds that launched, but on the whole, adaptation transactions are severely underfunded. And this does align with findings from the UN Environment Program, or UNEP, which found that in their adaptation gap report, progress on adaptation is slowing across all three areas annually assessed, namely finance, planning, implementation, where there's a critical need for it to be rapidly accelerating. And the financing gap is huge. It can be upwards in some estimates of $366 billion annually. And the adaptation finance needs in developing countries is likely to be 10 to 18 times as great as current financing flows. Again, this is why it's so important that organizations like Gary exist. And my hope today is that you'll understand how blended finance can be a tool to help close this financing gap. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see in a different way, again, how little attention adaptation has received over the past decade. So the chart on the left shows percent by deal count, while the chart on the right shows percent by aggregate financing volume. And while adaptation transactions accounted for 14% of total deals, they only made up 6% of financing. And this hones in on a really key problem in adaptation, which is scale. Many of these projects are quite small, which makes it difficult to attract institutional commercial investors. While the median size for mitigation transactions is $91 million and for cross-cutting $57 million, adaptation deals have only a median size of $37 million. So moving on to the next slide, there are a few challenges that come from trying to invest in adaptation transactions, and I'm not going to spend too long on these challenges since a lot of you are probably already very familiar with these. But first, there have been recent attempts to create frameworks around adaptation financing. So, for example, through the National Adaptation Plans or NAPs. And the purpose of NAPs is to reduce vulnerability to the impacts of climate change by building adaptive capacity and resilience, and to facilitate the integration of adaptation into new and existing policies. The NAP should also incorporate financing needs for each country, although most of them don't explicitly provide that breakdown. So while there are attempts such as NAPs to streamline adaptation financing, it's still relatively new, and many lack benchmarks and proper monitoring and evaluation methods. So this could leave investors feeling wary of investing in transactions with uncertain outcomes. We might also see this in other attempts to formalize adaptation finance needs that, despite efforts to streamline, the market is still largely disjointed, leaving investors confused and unsure. A second challenge is that adaptation transactions don't always have clear revenue streams, and this is something I've mentioned before. And there's also often an overlap with humanitarian aid. So adaptation-focused initiatives are not always immediately or obviously commercially viable, which is, again, why one of the many questions I get is how do I turn adaptation into something with a defined revenue stream? So we're going to hear shortly the case study from One Acre Fund where they can speak to their experience of doing so. But part of this challenge is addressing this challenge is not looking at adaptation through a singular lens, but seeing it as kind of an umbrella term. So there are certainly aspects of adaptation that aren't suitable for the commercial markets, where humanitarian assistance is crucial, but there are also emerging innovative ways to address adaptation needs where the private sector will be required. So thirdly, there's no standardized measurements in adaptation outcomes. So for mitigation, it's quite obvious. You're either removing tons of carbon from the atmosphere or preventing it from entering. But for adaptation, there's often facets of biodiversity, social welfare, and counterfactuals or things that didn't happen because of an intervention. designed and not easily accessible to collect the data needed to actually report on impact. So again, this leaves a lot of uncertainty for the outcome of these transaction types. So for all these reasons and others, adaptation is often seen as more convoluted and riskier than mitigation. And this is where blended finance can play a role. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see how, again, Convergence categorizes blended finance transactions by the type of vehicle through which blending is occurring. While in mitigation transactions, large-scale renewable energy infrastructure drives financing towards the project level, adaptation and cross-cutting transactions are primarily blended at the fund level. And there's a few reasons for this. The first is, again, going back to their relatively size. Since adaptation transactions tend to be small, it makes more sense for aggregation to happen at the fund level to reach a size that would be attractive to commercial investors. And there's also the matter of perceived risks, which again are higher for adaptation initiatives. So funds allow for risk diversification, which could allay some investor uncertainty. And especially if you consider how concessional capital can be used creatively within the fund structure to de-risk investments or enhance returns, it's easy to see how it can be a more attractive vehicle for adaptation initiatives. And then this final graph will show the number of deals that contain each archetype. And as we've already seen, one transaction can contain multiple archetypes. So concessional debt and equity tend to be the most popular archetypes used within blended finance overall. So it's unsurprising to see it's most heavily present in adaptation deals too. But we also see a good representation of technical assistance, which, as we've noted, can be especially effective in addressing many of the risks and challenges I spoke to earlier. So for example, using it to help define evaluation criteria and KPIs. And then funding can also be provided to purchase or use technology to track outcomes. So it's a really versatile to be effective in mobilizing private investors by reducing uncertainty. And the last thing I'll say before either we open it up for questions or move to 1 acre for a time is on the next slide, I just wanted to leave you with a practical show of who's actually investing in the adaptation field. So on this slide, we have the top public, private, and philanthropic and adaptation investors. This is a bit of an obvious caveat that these investors are backwards looking. So this is who has been the most active in the market. It's not necessarily indicative of which organizations might be most active moving forward, and this is especially true on the public institution side. However, it should give you a few ideas about the players that are working in the space. And one final observation is that a lot of these investors on the private and philanthropic sides especially are coming in and investing in only one or two of these transactions, so there are very few repeat investors. Our hope is that as the market gets more established and as networks like this continue to grow and gain traction, we'll start to see these investors engage in the adaptation market more regularly. So that's everything from me. Sarah, I'll leave it to you if we want to actually answer questions in the chat so that we can pass it off to Jeremy. Sneha and I are happy to actually respond to questions in the chat so we can give Jeremy his time.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to do just one or two really quick questions on some of the technical stuff that I think has come up that's really interesting. So is this mostly early stage investing that needs this blended finance? Is it any type of sector? Are you supporting mostly kind of venture capital? Is there growth equity sort of being supported by this? Are there sort of more commercial things going through banks? Can you just touch on, is this applicable to any stage of investing, or do you see it more in certain stages?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and great question. The beauty about blended finance is it's incredibly flexible and it can be used throughout the life cycle of a transaction. So certain elements of blended finance are perhaps more suited for very early stage deals. So if we're talking about design stage grants and design stage funding, that generally comes in very early. So that's like, pre-seed kind of proof of concept, that kind of early stage transaction. Whereas technical assistance can kind of be early, but it can also be throughout the entire life cycle. For example, funds can continuously use it in post-investment opportunities to continue increasing the viability and maximize impact within their portfolio. And then concessional debt can kind of come along, we can see it happen in later stage of fund development. So we see Series A that incorporates some concessional activity this way, and then Series B might incorporate concessional capital in a slightly different way. So it truly is, it spans the breadth and depth of every transaction. And in terms of who's using it, again, our members span development finance institutions, commercial investors, foundations, Sneha gave a really good, I think, overview of the kinds of players that are in the field.
Mm-hmm. But we found in our experience that it's most helpful to work backwards from the investment itself to think about blended finance, because there's really no point starting from blended finance first and thinking I want to blend something and going out to find something to blend. The key is that you are looking at a project or something, you are looking at investment that is, number one, making a return. So there is a return somewhere. There's potential to make money here. You see that it's a little bit less than bankable though. Right now in the current country or market where this investment exists, there is no capital that they're able to access. So you think to yourself, okay, a little bit of concessional capital here, a little bit of risk mitigation or return enhancement here could unlock much more capital. And that's where you're like, okay, this is suitable for blending. This is where I can start looking at, blended finance structures for this. But there's really no point working the other way, thinking like, I want to do blended finance. And then like that doesn't make any rational sense from what we've seen. You have to start from the investment first and work your way backwards and decide, like, is this suitable for blending? Does it need just a little bit of help to get it over that risk return line and into the realm of a bankable project and able to access the capital markets on its own and unlock a bunch of other follow-on investment? So this is tricky for adaptation because, the nascent field, it's still growing, unproven or untested. Business models are still being found. Impact metrics are not necessarily aligned across different ecosystems or biomes. So it's a little bit tricky, but that's where, again, more grant capital, maybe early stage, proving some of these out or testing some of these out would be useful to help the market.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you guys both for that answer. And yes, please, if you guys can answer some of the questions in the chat, please keep them coming. And let's pass it over to One Acre Fund.
Cool and perfect. I think Sneha's answer is a perfect segue into what we're going to be discussing, where we saw a problem and then found a blended finance approach for that. Can everyone see my screen? Should see a farmer holding some avocados.
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you for the time. My name is Jeremy Golan. I'm the managing director of One Acre Ventures, which maybe some of you on the call know as Smallholder Resilience Ventures, or SRV. We just rebranded to One Acre Ventures to be closer to our mission. And it's a subsidiary of One Acre Fund, which actually is also a blended finance transaction. And we're fortunate to receive funding from the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility and those preparation funding and acceleration support that Sneha and Robin had mentioned. So I'll speak a little bit about One Acre Fund, which is the parent company, and then get much more into One Acre Ventures, which you'll see touches on nearly all of the types of blended finance that Robin and Sneha spoke about. So One Acre Fund is a nonprofit social enterprise, meaning it's a nonprofit in the US, but has a variety of revenue streams, such as grants, farmer payments, concessional debt, and most of the team and staff, about 99%, are actually based in Africa. And we're also launching a blended finance fund called One Acre Ventures, which, like I said, I'll speak about for most of the presentation. But just a little bit of background on One Acre Fund. One Acre Fund exists to make smallholder farmers more prosperous. We started by providing high-quality farm inputs on credit, delivered conveniently within walking distance to farmers. And this simple yet impactful model is helping millions of African smallholder farmers increase their incomes and adapt to climate change. We now operate in 9 countries across East, Southern, and West Africa, and work with over 4 million farmer households total, with over 50% women clients. And we've been working on a lot of different areas to help farmers adapt to climate change and be more prosperous. And a big one is around value chains, which is what led us to our blended finance journey with One Acre Ventures. So let me start with the challenge that led to this work that we were seeing in the field. The value chain challenges that led us to start One Acre Ventures start with farmers. Smallholder farmers, especially women, are some of the most vulnerable people to climate change, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows. And a key way for farmers to increase their resilience is to diversify away from monocropping, so just planting corn or just planting beans, and move into planting high value climate resilient crops, such as fruit trees and other perennial crops. And these crops are significantly more resilient to drought and flood than cereals, and they also improve soil health and sequester carbon and are of higher value as an output. So diversifying growing staple crops plus growing these high value resilient crops can really help farmers adapt to climate change and increase their incomes. But farmers are often not incentivized to plant these crops given the challenges in the relative value chains. Businesses are operating these rural value chains are often underfinanced. They don't have the capacity to source from smallholders or do not view smallholders as a source of high quality supply. And as a result, they're not guaranteed the market of farmers and thus do not invest in this critical shift in their planting. And the businesses don't invest in the sourcing. And as a result, to the point of this presentation, investors are not attracted to these value chains given their low productivity, and every piece is kind of working against itself. And that's where our solution comes in, which is to invest in small and medium enterprises active in these value chains, for example, agri-processors and exporters. And then it's complemented by the direct work of 1 Acre Funds supporting the smallholder farmers directly. And that creates a virtuous cycle where farmers invest more in climate resilience and businesses source more harvests, increasing revenue and ultimately attracting more investment. And over time, this cycle continues, attracting more private capital. These SMEs grow, these economies grow, more investment comes in, and that's where blended finance comes in. So that's why we started 1 Acre Ventures. 1 Acre Ventures invests in high-impact agri-SMEs that offtake from smallholder farmers. Legally, that work is currently a subsidiary of 1 Acre Fund, but thanks to Convergence's help with the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility, we're in the process of establishing a fund structure in Mauritius, which is a popular blended finance domicile for Africa. And the ambition is for a scaled independent fund that spins out from 1 Acre Fund and attracts investors. And practically, skipped a slide by mistake. Practically, we invest in companies within 1 Acre Fund's network on the ground in Africa, leveraging 1 Acre Fund's local presence. Like I said, 99% of the staff is in these markets. They know the market well, and they have this large base of millions of farmer households that can provide supply to de-risk these investments. And as you can see, there's a lot of complementarity here. 1 Acre Fund supports the farmers, incentivizing tree planting, training, access to markets, and then the investments from 1 Acre Ventures enable businesses to buy more from farmers and create this virtuous cycle where the businesses do well, the investments do well, and then the smallholder farmers do well, and plant more trees and improve the soil and adapt to climate change. And one way we're blending is actually taking a phased approach to scaling to de-risk the fund. And specifically, this phased approach enables us to develop a robust pipeline, prove impact and scalability, and ultimately de-risk for investors. The first phase is a pilot and design. We had $2 million from 1 Acre Fund's balance sheet, and we're able to invest in 4 agri-SMEs and basically prove this concept that this can benefit farmers, this can attract private capital, this works, it's viable. And then we moved on to the current phase, which is the warehousing phase, where we're building more pipeline, investing more, bringing on an experienced fund manager who can help us grow this thing. And then we'll move on to a fund phase where we'll attract investors and DFIs and various kinds of capitals with blending. And due to those previous phases, they'll see the track record, they'll see how the risk is managed, they'll see the real numbers, and it makes it more comfortable to the point about de-risking transactions. In addition, we're using a few of the other blending tactics described in the previous presentation. What we're doing is using a preferred return facility, which basically we take the cash and portfolio from the warehousing phase, move that over, it becomes the most junior subordinate layer, which then, if the fund is profitable, which we expect, certain investors will get a higher return. And if the fund underperforms, it would provide a first loss layer. And we expect this to attract more senior investors with higher return expectations and lower risk tolerance, and also hopefully crowd in other investors at the more junior layers to attract more senior investors and catalyze capital here. And then also, as described in the presentation, we have a TA facility, which would be grant finance, to support the SMEs in reaching farmers and becoming more investable. And overall, we believe this blended finance structure will help us attract private capital. And I'll end with a few lessons that I'd love to share with you all. Forgive the text-heavy slide. But we've learned a lot about how to mitigate risk from a 2-year pilot. Number one, we see how the local presence we have can help us design around agribusiness needs and do effective origination. Secondly, we see the importance of the farmer base from One Acre Fund to provide supply and benefit from the investments. And lastly, the importance of technical assistance as a key blending mechanism to help the businesses grow and connect with farmers. And then during this warehousing phase, we're focused on impact at scale. A key challenge for us in blended finance in agriculture is how to get the economics right. I saw a few things in the chat about how do you ensure that impact is happening, how do you ensure local communities are benefiting, but at the same time, I'm sure the more commercial investors on this webinar are asking, well, how do you get large enough ticket sizes? How do you ensure you have the risk-adjusted return? So we're really looking at how we can balance all those things, both the benefits to smallholder farmers and that the fund is economically viable and efficient. And our hypothesis is that this would be through a mix of ticket sizes, the smaller ticket sizes to really catalyze, and the larger ticket sizes to reach companies that then can serve more smallholder farmers. So that's our thesis. And yeah, as you're all probably taking away from this webinar, there's a lot to balance here, but we think the impact and the ability to attract more capital to this important mission to serve farmers is worth it. Thank you for listening, and I can also take questions with our last few minutes. Or Sarah, over to you if maybe stay on. Robin will take some questions.
Yeah, we have a couple more minutes, and thank you everybody for participating in the chat. If you have any last minute questions for Jeremy or the conversions team, please include them. Jeremy, I would love to ask a question kind of building on this idea that you explained really eloquently of why this makes sense to phase and kind of bringing in different capital at different points. What is your sort of longer term vision of attracting maybe more traditional investors? Are there investors that you're thinking we can build it and it's going to have that risk return profile that's going to bring in maybe some of those institutional investors that we saw on the convergence slide on the far left that are kind of a little bit more market rate versus the impact first or impact focused investors like DFIs? Do you kind of have a vision for that as you build this facility?
Yeah, I think it's exactly how you described it at the end of your question. It's a journey for us. Right now, we're in the grant phase. We'll move into the more impact-oriented phase that's generating returns, but not those larger commercial returns. Then as we prove more and de-risk, there's more pipeline. Other people see the benefit. More commercial people come in. I mean, agriculture, even in developed markets, is a high-risk sector, so we're trying to reduce that risk, and we know that takes time and persistence. That's why we're taking this step-by-step approach. But yeah, the long-term vision is all kinds of capital serving this mission and growing these markets.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, yeah, if anybody has any additional questions, please include them in the chat. We'll try to, I'll leave this going for just a couple of minutes. I'm sure that folks need to sign off, but thank you to everybody who joined us today, to our speakers, to Convergence and One Acre Fund. Again, we're really focusing these webinars and conversations around the ideas of, in order to meet the needs globally of adaptation and resilience, there's a huge role for the private sector. I think Convergence really highlighted at the beginning the limited concessionary finance that's out there, the limited government financing through blended finance is one of the best ways that we can actually bring in that private sector capital, especially into markets that might be a little bit riskier, regions that are a little bit riskier, or new technologies and kind of new sectors. And adaptation and resilience definitely fits into that, although in some ways they're pretty traditional sectors. We've been investing in agriculture for a long time in different ways, especially in some of these regions. So thank you to our speakers for highlighting that. Again, if you have more questions or questions for what Gary is doing in this space, how we're bringing together investors to try to promote more private sector investment into adaptation and resilience, into funds like One Acre Fund, working with some of those organizations that were highlighted by Convergence to do this work, please let me know. You all have my email because you received this invite. But yeah, thank you again. And I'm just going to leave the chat going for a couple of minutes. We can kind of close out some of those questions.